Imagine being born into a code that loves your courage more than your life. In samurai Japan, Bushido did not guide you. It stalked you from childhood and only called you honorable once you were dead. Everyone quotes Bushido like a self-help book. Calm warriors, clean armor, a beautiful ritual death that proves you lived by some higher standard. But if you were a samurai child, Bushido didn't feel like poetry. It felt like growing up in a world where failing a test could end with your blood on the floor. Here's the part nobody talks about. The same code that people now put on motivational posters was used to pressure men into cutting themselves open, to force mass suicides when castles fell, to turn cruelty into something you were supposed to feel proud of. If honor can demand your death on command, how much of it was ever really your choice? From the time you could walk, samurai adults started training you to be comfortable with death. You heard heroic war stories as bedtime tales. You listened to grown men laugh about severed heads the way other people talked about trophies. You were taken to watch executions and to look at corpses so you would not flinch later. You were told that fear was shameful, that pain was nothing, that real failure was not losing. It was being too weak to die the right way when the time came. This is where the story stops making sense. When you approached coming of age, you faced tests that went way beyond normal training. Long periods of harsh physical drills, endless repetition with the sword until your hands bled. Little food, little sleep. Sometimes being locked alone in the dark for hours or days to see if you would break. Passing meant you were finally ready to be called a warrior. Failing meant you were not just disappointing your parents. You were staining the family, the clan, the ancestors who were watching you. Some accounts talk about children being beaten not just for mistakes in technique, but for showing fear. If your hand shook on the practice sword, you learned to hide it. If you cried after seeing a body, you learned to cry where no one could see you. Survival meant learning to act like death did not bother you at all. Now ask yourself this. If your whole childhood is built around the threat of shame, where does choice actually fit in? On the battlefield, Bushido was not just about courage. It was measured in body parts. Samurai who killed enemies were expected to bring back proof. The proof was the head. Officers' heads were worth more than common soldiers. Famous enemies were worth more still. The more heads you carried, the more valuable you looked when you stood in front of your lord. Here's the part nobody talks about. After a battle, there were formal head inspections. Samurai lined up. Officials examined the heads to confirm who had killed whom and to decide who deserved rewards. They checked faces. They checked scars. They questioned witnesses. Promotion, stipends, and status could rise or fall based on how many faces you laid out on the mat. Some families even cleaned the severed heads and put makeup on them. Wives washed the blood off. They combed the hair. They applied powder and color so the face would hold together for inspection. It was meant as a twisted sign of respect for a worthy enemy. It also made the trophy look more presentable in front of judges. And if that still feels distant, think about this. Somewhere a child walked past that room and saw their mother fixing the face of a dead stranger so their father might get promoted. For that child, honor looked like a severed head on a tray. Be honest. What would you have believed if you grew up in that system? Would you call that honor? Or just a very pretty word for hunting human beings? Away from the battlefield, the sharpest edge of Bushido cut inward. It cut at you. If your lord lost, if your castle fell, if you were captured, the code held up one honorable option: seppuku. Ritual suicide by cutting open your own abdomen. In theory, it proved courage and loyalty. In practice, it was often a way to control fear, to tie up loose ends, to keep enemies from taking prisoners who might talk. That is the official version. Here is the problem with it. There were times when entire groups of samurai killed themselves together because the code said it was better than living with failure. At one castle in Kyoto, over 300 samurai chose seppuku rather than be captured. The floorboards that soaked up their blood were later reused as temple ceilings. People still walk under those boards today and call them blood ceilings. Imagine standing in that temple, looking up at the boards, seeing dark stains shaped like feet and hands pressed into the wood. People treat it like a strange tourist fact. The ceiling is literally soaked with the last moments of men who were taught that dying on command was the only clean way to end their story. Teenage fighters did the same. One group of young samurai saw smoke in the distance. They thought their city had fallen. They chose mass suicide instead of going home alive. They died for a mistake, for a rumor, for an assumption that turned out to be wrong. Now ask yourself this. If your culture teaches children that killing themselves for a mistake is noble, how different is that from a death cult? There is another detail people skip. Seppuku was not always a calm ritual with plenty of time to prepare. Sometimes it was forced. Sometimes it was a sentence. A higher-ranking official told you that you had to die. You carried out the sentence yourself so they could still call it honor. Witnesses watched to make sure you followed the script. If you hesitated, you could be pushed or finished by another blade. For most of Japan's history, there was not one neat universal code called Bushido carved in stone. Different clans had different expectations. Different writers and thinkers had different ideas about what a good warrior was. Some texts stressed loyalty above all. Others stressed honesty. Others stressed skill in battle or skill in poetry. There was no single rulebook that every samurai read and followed line by line. The clean version of Bushido people quote today was stitched together much later, when Japan needed a proud, unified story about its past. Modern writers and politicians reached back into history. They cherry-picked old tales, sayings, and legends. They turned that mix into a timeless warrior code that was supposed to explain the Japanese spirit. Here is the part nobody talks about. They were not just writing about the past, they were shaping the future. If you can convince people that their ancestors lived by a perfect code, you can tell them they have to live up to it now. If you say the old warriors never complained, never questioned orders, and never feared death, you can shame anyone who does those things today. As Japan modernized, Bushido became more than a samurai ethic. It became part of national identity. It helped push people to accept hardship, to obey the state, to see death for the nation as honorable. Textbooks, speeches, and propaganda leaned on it. The message was simple. Real loyalty meant you were ready to die if the state asked. The ugly parts, the cruelty, the forced suicides, the head collecting, the children trained to see bodies as normal. Those did not make the posters or the school lessons. Those details got buried under cleaner words. Spirit, sacrifice, honor. This is where it stops being a fun story and starts having real consequences. A cleaned-up myth of honorable death and total loyalty made it easier to justify real brutality later. At home, and on battlefields far from Japan. When soldiers were told that surrender was shameful and capture was worse than death, the old language of Bushido was right there, ready to be used again. It is easy to talk about Bushido in abstract words: honor, duty, loyalty. It is harder to sit with what that meant for one person who could not escape it. Picture a young samurai who failed to protect his lord. Maybe he misread a signal. Maybe he dropped his guard at the wrong moment. Maybe the enemy was just stronger. He knows the right answer is to open his own stomach. If he lives, he carries shame. If he dies, people praise his courage. Which option is he really free to choose? Picture a wife or daughter putting makeup on an enemy head, because that is what respect looks like in this world. You do not get to decide if the practice itself is monstrous. You only get to decide whether you do it well. Picture a boy standing under a blood ceiling, listening to an elder explain how noble those deaths were, how loyal, how pure. No one asks him if it sounds horrifying. They just tell him this is what real honor looks like. Now ask yourself this. How many ordinary people went along with these rituals not because they believed in some pure code, but because there was no safe way to say no? Bushido turns those private fears into a public story. In the story, you are not terrified. You are noble. You are not trapped. You are loyal. You are not pressured into killing yourself. You are choosing a glorious end. The system still gets what it wants. You just get a better caption on your death. So, why does Bushido still show up in posters, anime, and discipline books today? Part of it is simple. A clean story about unbreakable honor feels good. It makes the world look less messy. Another part hits closer. A code that turns pain into meaning is powerful. If suffering proves you are strong and loyal, then all the hard things in your life can feel like a test you are passing instead of a cage you are stuck in. Now ask yourself this. When a show gives you a lone samurai who never doubts, never complains, and dies with a perfect line on his lips, what is it training you to admire? Strength or silence? We still use that pattern now. We just swap out swords for other tools. Work cultures that glorify burnout talk like Bushido. They say real dedication means never resting, never questioning the boss, wearing exhaustion like a badge. Online grind culture does it too. It tells you to bleed for the hustle, to sacrifice your health and relationships, to prove you want it enough. Here is the part nobody talks about. Any system that demands self-destruction and calls it virtue is playing the same game. The labels change, the language changes, the pressure feels very familiar. When someone tells you that real loyalty means you never say no, that is Bushido logic. When someone tells you that the only shame is quitting, not what they are asking you to do, that is Bushido logic too. At the start, I told you we would look past the pretty quotes and see how Bushido really worked when you could not walk away. You have seen what childhood training looked like, what head collecting meant, how forced suicides were folded into an honor code, and how the myth of Bushido was polished up later and used to fuel even bigger demands for sacrifice. Here is the one secret that actually matters. Bushido is not just a story about samurai. It is a blueprint for how any powerful system can turn your fear of shame into willing obedience. Call it honor, call it loyalty, call it grind, call it culture. The trick is the same. Convince you that the more you suffer, the more worthy you are. Convince you that the real shame is not what they are asking you to do. It is daring to say no. Now ask yourself this. When you see a quote about honor or discipline or sacrifice, who benefits if you believe it without asking questions? If honor demands you bleed for someone else's story, is it really your honor? Or just their code written on your body? If you want more dark history and myth versus reality without the comforting gloss, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next deep dive. And tell me in the comments which part of this story you think is the most dangerous myth. The clean image of the noble samurai, or the idea that turning cruelty into discipline is something we should still admire.